Consider this scenario. A waterway that has controlled 20% of the planet's oil supply for 50 years suddenly becomes meaningless overnight, and virtually no one, except a handful of engineers and analysts, notices. This isn't a headline exaggeration. This is the real situation unfolding in the Persian Gulf right now. I would say this is one of the quietest and most significant shifts in the balance of power in the Middle East that I have ever witnessed. Bear with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand 4 things that almost no one in the mainstream media has properly explained. What was actually built and where, why it was built for years without anyone raising the alarm, what this means for Iran's entire military doctrine built around the strait, and that the panic coming from Tehran has almost nothing to do with a single war and is related to a war already lost before the current conflicts even began. Let's get the geography straight first, because this is where a lot of casual coverage falls apart. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow channel, roughly 33 kilometers across at its tightest point, separating Iran's southern coastline from Oman's Musandam Peninsula. Every tanker carrying crude out of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq has traditionally had to squeeze through that gap to reach open water. For half a century, that geography has been Iran's single greatest strategic asset. It didn't need a blue water navy. It didn't need to match American carrier groups, ship for ship. It only needed the credible threat of closing one narrow channel to force oil markets into a state of permanent anxiety. That threat shaped everything. It shaped how much the U.S. Navy invested in Gulf patrols. It shaped how the Revolutionary Guard built its entire coastal defense doctrine around fast attack boats, shore-based anti-ship missiles, and naval mines. It shaped how every negotiation with Tehran carried an unspoken understanding that pushing too hard risked a crisis at the world's most important oil choke point. That entire calculation just collapsed. And it collapsed because of infrastructure, not diplomacy, and not a single missile strike. Here's the part that gets lost in most reporting. This isn't one new pipeline. It's an interconnected network of pipelines, pumping stations, and deep water export terminals stretching across 3 different Gulf states, engineered specifically so that crude produced anywhere near the Gulf coastline never has to touch a tanker inside range of Iranian coastal weapons. The backbone of the system is a dramatically expanded version of Saudi Arabia's east to west pipeline corridor. This isn't new. The original line dates back to the early 1980s, built as an emergency overflow route during the Iran-Iraq War, when Hormuz traffic was already under threat. But that original system moved a relatively modest volume, enough to serve as a backup, nowhere near enough to functionally replace the strait. Over the last several years, without the kind of press conferences that usually accompany major energy projects, Saudi Aramco tripled the throughput of that corridor. New pump stations went in along the route. Sections of pipe were widened. And most importantly, the loading terminal on the Red Sea coast was rebuilt from the ground up, with new berths, expanded tank farms, and deep channels capable of loading the largest crude carriers afloat. The corridor can now move an enormous share of Saudi Arabia's total daily output clear across the peninsula to a coast Iran cannot threaten with a single weapon system it possesses. The UAE built its own version of the same insurance policy. A pipeline connecting inland oil fields to a terminal on the Gulf of Oman has technically existed since the early 2010s, but it ran under capacity for years, because keeping a redundant, expensive export route fully staffed and active only made sense if the primary route through Hormuz was genuinely at risk. That calculation flipped. The line is now running near its ceiling, moving Emirati crude directly to a terminal that faces open ocean. No straight transit required at all. Kuwait, historically the most exposed of the Gulf producers because of its position deep inside the Gulf itself, added a connector line tying its northern fields into the Saudi corridor. That single addition let Kuwaiti crude reach the same Red Sea terminals using infrastructure it doesn't have to build and maintain on its own, in exchange for transit agreements that represent a level of coordinated Gulf Arab energy planning that frankly didn't exist a decade ago. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened quickly. It happened in phases, spread out across years, under the cover of routine-sounding announcements about export diversification and energy security modernization. Nobody was lying exactly, they just weren't advertising the true strategic purpose, because the entire value of the project depended on it becoming operational before Iran, or anyone else fully understood what it meant. Before we go further, it's worth understanding exactly how Iran built this leverage in the first place, because the collapse only makes sense once you see how deliberately the original position was constructed. In the years following the 1979 revolution, Tehran inherited a military that was, by regional standards, undersized and underfunded compared to its Gulf Arab neighbors, who had oil wealth pouring into modern air forces and Western-supplied hardware. Iran couldn't match that spending, so its planners made a different bet. Instead of trying to outbuild rivals ship for ship or jet for jet, they invested in asymmetric capability concentrated at a single geographic pinch point. That decision paid off for decades. Every U.S. carrier group transiting the Gulf did so, knowing that a swarm of small, fast Revolutionary Guard boats could theoretically overwhelm point defenses through sheer numbers. Every insurer pricing tanker coverage factored in the possibility of mines or missile strikes near the Iranian coast. Every OPEC production discussion happened against the backdrop of an unspoken understanding that roughly a fifth of the world's oil moved through a channel one country could, in theory, close. That's an extraordinary amount of geopolitical weight resting on 33 kilometers of water. And Iran understood exactly how to keep cashing in on it without ever having to actually close the strait for good. The threat alone did the work. That's the core mechanism of deterrence. And Iran ran that playbook better than almost any mid-sized power in modern history. Which is exactly why the bypass network matters so much. It doesn't need to defeat Iran's navy in open combat. It just needs to make the threat non-credible. And a threat that stops being credible stops generating leverage. Full stop. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. This system reached full operational readiness at almost the exact moment Iran has been most aggressively signaling intent to disrupt shipping through Hormuz. That is not a coincidence, and it's not really a surprise if you understand how infrastructure planning actually works. You don't build a multi-billion-dollar bypass network in 6 months in response to a single crisis. You build it over years, quietly, specifically, so that it's ready before the crisis arrives, not after. Think about what that means from a planning perspective. Saudi, Emirati, and American officials made a long-term bet years ago that Iranian leverage over Hormuz would eventually be tested in a serious way. And they built the alternative before that test happened, rather than scrambling afterward. That is a remarkably patient, remarkably disciplined piece of strategic engineering, and it's exactly the kind of long-horizon thinking that rarely makes headlines because there's no dramatic footage of it. There's no missile launch, no burning ship, no press conference with generals standing at podiums. There's just pipe in the ground and terminals coming online, quietly rendering an entire category of Iranian military capability obsolete. Let's get into some of the technical specifics for a moment, because the scale of this project only really lands once you understand what deep water crude terminals actually require to function at this level. Building a terminal capable of loading the largest crude carriers in the world isn't just a matter of running a pipe to a dock. You need channel depth sufficient for fully laden, very large crude carriers. Vessels that can displace over 300,000 tons when loaded. You need offshore mooring systems robust enough to handle loading operations in open water conditions. Because unlike a sheltered Gulf port, a Red Sea or Arabian Sea terminal faces real ocean swell. You need redundant pumping capacity so that a single mechanical failure doesn't stall the entire export chain. And you need storage capacity substantial enough to buffer against fluctuations in pipeline throughput, maintenance windows, and shifts in tanker scheduling. The expanded Red Sea terminal complex now holds storage capacity in the tens of millions of barrels, enough buffer to keep loading operations running continuously, even during upstream maintenance cycles. The Gulf of Oman terminal facilities underwent a similar transformation, with new deep berths and expanded mooring infrastructure specifically engineered to handle tanker traffic that used to flow exclusively through Hormuz. None of this is cheap, and none of it is fast. Projects at this scale typically take years from initial engineering studies to full operational certification. Which brings us back to the timeline question, because understanding how long this actually took to build tells you everything about how deliberate this strategy really was. For decades, the mere possibility of a Hormuz closure has functioned like a tax on global energy markets. Every time tensions spiked in the Gulf, traders priced in a risk premium because a closed strait meant a genuine supply shock, and genuine supply shocks move prices hard and fast. That premium has been baked into how oil markets function for as long as most traders working today have had a career. That premium is now eroding in real time, and the market is adjusting faster than most people expected. When Iran recently declared intent to shut the strait, crude prices spiked initially, the way they always have, but this time the spike didn't hold. Within days, prices drifted back toward where they had been before the declaration, because tankers kept loading. Shipments kept arriving at refineries on schedule. The supply disruption that traders were pricing in simply never showed up, because the oil never needed to go anywhere near the strait in the first place. Markets learn from repetition. Every time Iran issues a closure threat and the promised disruption doesn't materialize, the credibility of the next threat erodes a little further. Give that pattern a few more cycles, and you get exactly what's happening now. Traders treating Iranian rhetoric about Hormuz as background noise instead of a genuine pricing signal. That shift alone strips away most of the coercive value Iran used to extract just from talking about closing the strait, without a single ship ever being stopped. It's worth pausing on how the demand side of this equation is responding, because energy security planning in Asia and Europe has quietly shifted in parallel with the supply side infrastructure. Refiners in East Asia, who depend heavily on Gulf crude, have spent the last several years diversifying their own contractual language. building and routing flexibility clauses that specify delivery from bypass-capable terminals rather than strictly Hormuz transiting cargoes. That's not something oil traders do casually. It reflects a genuine recalibration of how much geopolitical risk premium buyers are willing to price into long-term supply contracts tied to a single choke point. European buyers, already sensitized to energy security concerns after years of supply shocks from other regions, have shown similar behavior, favoring term contracts explicitly routed through Red Sea loading points where available. None of this is happening because of a coordinated announcement or treaty. It's happening because buyers, insurers, and shipping companies all independently arrived at the same conclusion at roughly the same time. The bypass network works, it's reliable, and betting against Iranian rhetoric disrupting it has become a losing wager more often than not. That kind of organic, market-driven confidence is far more durable than any diplomatic assurance could ever be, because it doesn't depend on trust in any government's promises. It depends on tankers actually arriving on schedule, month after month, regardless of what's being declared on Iranian state television. Now let's talk about what this actually costs Iran strategically, because the number is staggering when you add it up. For 5 decades, the Islamic Republic poured resources into a military structure built almost entirely around one geographic assumption: that controlling access to Hormuz meant controlling leverage over the global economy. Coastal anti-ship missile batteries, fast attack boat squadrons designed for swarming tactics against larger vessels, naval mine stockpiles, shore-based radar and surveillance networks stretching the length of the Iranian coastline, submarine forces optimized for shallow, congested Gulf waters rather than open ocean operations, billions of dollars, decades of training cycles, entire branches of the Revolutionary Guard's naval wing built around a single strategic premise. And that premise just stopped being true. Iran can still, in a purely technical sense, sink a tanker inside the strait. It can still lay mines. It can still fire missiles at passing vessels. But if none of that actually interrupts the flow of oil to global markets because the oil has already been rerouted around a choke point those weapons were built to control, then the tactical success of any individual attack becomes strategically meaningless. You can win every skirmish in the strait and still lose the war for leverage, because the thing you're fighting over no longer determines the outcome anybody cares about. That is the uncomfortable reality settling into Tehran's strategic planning circles right now, and it's a much harder problem to solve than a single lost battle. You can't rebuild geography. You can't move Iran's coastline somewhere more relevant. The investment is sunk, the weapons still exist, but the leverage they were built to generate has been engineered out of existence by infrastructure, sitting hundreds of kilometers away from anything Iran's military can reach. There's a dimension to this story that gets less attention than the pipelines themselves, and it's the internal political fallout inside Iran's own governing structure. For decades, the Revolutionary Guard's Naval Command has justified an enormous share of its budget, its institutional prestige, and its influence over broader Iranian strategic policy on the basis of controlling access to Hormuz. That's not just a military talking point, it's a foundation of internal bureaucratic power. Commanders who built careers around coastal defense doctrine, procurement officials who justified missile and fast boat acquisition programs, entire training pipelines built around swarm tactics in constrained waters. All of that institutional weight rested on the assumption that the strait would remain strategically decisive indefinitely. When that assumption erodes, the political consequences inside Tehran's security establishment can be just as significant as the external ones. Budget justifications that made sense 5 years ago look increasingly difficult to defend internally, when the capability they fund no longer produces coercive leverage. That kind of institutional reckoning doesn't happen quickly or publicly, but it tends to produce exactly the kind of visible anxiety and escalatory rhetoric we're now seeing, because entrenched interests rarely accept strategic obsolescence quietly. Escalation, in this light, isn't just a message aimed outward at Washington and the Gulf states, it's also a message aimed inward, an attempt to prove continued relevance to a domestic audience that funds and depends on these programs. This is the question every analyst covering this story keeps circling back to. The honest answer is, not easily and not quickly. Iran has a handful of theoretical countermoves, and none of them solve the fundamental problem. The most discussed option is leaning harder on proxy forces in Yemen to threaten shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait near the Red Sea, extending pressure toward the bypass terminals themselves rather than accepting they're out of reach. But that's a fundamentally different choke point with different defensive challenges, and the capabilities available to project that kind of pressure have been degraded by sustained coalition operations for years now. It's a much weaker lever than the one Iran is losing, not a replacement for it. Sabotage against the pipeline infrastructure itself is another theoretical option, but pipelines are inherently easier to defend than moving tankers. They can be buried. They can be monitored continuously with modern sensor networks. They can be guarded by dedicated security forces along their entire length. And even a successful sabotage operation produces only temporary disruption. Pipelines get repaired, terminals get rebuilt. The strategic value of the bypass network is large enough that Gulf states and their partners will commit whatever resources are necessary to keep it running, because the alternative is sliding back into a dependency they spent years and billions of dollars specifically engineering their way out of. There's a broader pattern in military history worth remembering here. One side hardens or bypasses a vulnerability. The other side eventually adapts and the cycle continues. But adaptation takes time, resources, and geography that cooperates. Right now, Iran has none of those three things working in its favor. There's another layer to this shift worth examining closely, because it doesn't just change Iran's calculus, it changes the calculus for the United States Navy as well. For decades, a significant share of American naval commitment in the region existed specifically to guarantee freedom of navigation through Hormuz, keeping a carrier strike group or amphibious ready group within striking distance of the strait at almost all times, running minesweeping exercises with Gulf partners, and maintaining a nearly continuous presence of patrol craft and surveillance assets focused on that single channel. If the global economy no longer depends on Hormuz remaining open, the strategic justification for that specific posture starts to shift too. That doesn't mean American naval presence in the region disappears. Regional stability, counter-piracy operations, and broader deterrence against Iranian activity still matter. But the emphasis changes. Less of the mission profile centers on guaranteeing tanker safety through one narrow channel, and more of it can shift toward broader regional deterrence, counter-proxy operations, and supporting the security of the bypass infrastructure itself, which now represents the actual center of gravity for regional energy security. That's a meaningful reallocation of military attention and resources, and it's one more reason why Gulf partners were willing to fund such an expensive infrastructure project in the first place. It doesn't just remove economic leverage from Iran, it fundamentally reshapes what kind of American military commitment the region requires going forward, potentially freeing up naval assets for other theaters entirely. Military and economic history is full of moments where a choke point that once defined an entire strategic era quietly lost its relevance once technology or infrastructure caught up with it. The Cape of Good Hope route around Africa dominated global trade for centuries until the Suez Canal made it largely obsolete for most traffic. Then, when Suez was closed during periods of conflict in the 20th century, shippers rediscovered the Cape route as a viable, if longer, alternative, proving that no choke point's dominance is ever truly permanent once alternatives become financially and logistically viable. The pattern here follows a similar logic. A choke point's power isn't really about geography alone, it's about the absence of a workable alternative. The moment a credible, reliable, cost-effective alternative exists, the choke point's coercive value collapses, regardless of how strategically important it was the day before. What's happening in the Gulf right now is a modern, compressed version of that same historical pattern, except this time it happened deliberately and by design, rather than as a side effect of a canal being blocked by accident or conflict. Some analysts have floated the idea that this shift could reverse itself once the current round of tension cools down, that shippers might drift back toward the traditional Hormuz route out of habit or cost once the crisis passes. That view misunderstands how infrastructure decisions actually work once they're made. Nobody dismantles a multi-billion-dollar pipeline network because tensions temporarily ease. The bypass routes don't just solve a wartime problem, they eliminate a permanent category of risk that Hormuz transit has always carried, even during calm periods: piracy risk, congestion risk, navigational hazards in a narrow, heavily trafficked channel, and the ever-present possibility that Iranian rhetoric turns into Iranian action again with no warning. Shippers and refiners value predictability above almost everything else, and a bypass network that has proven itself operationally reliable becomes the preferred routing choice regardless of what happens diplomatically, simply because certainty is worth paying for. That's the part that should really worry Tehran's long-term planners. This isn't a crisis response measure that gets quietly scaled back once the headlines move on. It's now the default architecture of Gulf oil exports, and every month it continues operating successfully, makes it more entrenched, not less. One more thread worth pulling on before we zoom back out. The maritime insurance industry, which is usually one of the most conservative, risk-averse sectors in global finance, has already started adjusting its own models around this shift. War risk premiums for tankers transiting Hormuz have historically spiked sharply during periods of tension, sometimes adding meaningful costs to a single voyage almost overnight. Underwriters price risk based on probability of loss, and for decades, that probability was inseparable from Iranian activity near the strait. What's changing now is subtler but important. Underwriters are increasingly differentiating between cargoes routed through the traditional strait transit and cargoes loaded at bypass terminals outside Iranian threat range, effectively creating two different risk categories for what used to be treated as a single homogeneous market. That kind of granular repricing doesn't happen based on rhetoric or political promises. It happens based on actuarial data, accumulated over repeated voyages, showing that bypass routed cargo simply isn't exposed to the same loss profile. Once insurers start pricing a structural shift into their models, that's about as close to a permanent verdict as global markets ever render on a geopolitical question. Step back for a second and look at the elegance of the strategy here, because it's worth appreciating on its own terms. Washington and its Gulf partners didn't need to defeat Iran militarily to neutralize its most important source of regional leverage. They didn't need regime change. They didn't need a negotiated settlement on any of the usual sticking points. They just needed to make the thing Iran threatens strategically irrelevant. If Iran controls one route, build a better one that avoids it entirely. If Iran threatens closure, build alternatives robust enough that closure stops mattering economically. It's a remarkably simple concept, executed with patience over years, rather than urgency over months. And the fact that it's now fully operational and functioning exactly as designed is the clearest possible proof that the underlying strategy was sound. And here's what should really catch your attention. Every time Iran escalates rhetoric or interdiction attempts against the reduced tanker traffic still using Hormuz, it only reinforces the logic of the bypass network for everyone watching. The more aggressive the posture in the strait, the stronger the incentive for shippers to keep using routes entirely outside Iranian threat range. Iran, in trying to reassert relevance, may actually be accelerating the exact outcome it's desperate to prevent. What we're watching unfold isn't really a story about pipelines, even though pipelines are the physical mechanism making it happen. It's a story about the permanent collapse of a leverage point that shaped an entire regional power structure for 50 years. The geography that made Iran strategically unavoidable has been engineered around. The military capability built to exploit that geography still exists, but it no longer produces the outcome it was designed to produce. Iran will keep issuing statements through state media. The Revolutionary Guard will keep conducting exercises near the strait. Closure threats will keep coming because that rhetoric has been central to Iranian strategic messaging for decades, and institutions don't abandon a playbook overnight even after it stops working. But the substance behind those threats keeps thinning out with every cycle that passes without a real supply disruption following the declaration. The panic reportedly spreading through parts of Iran's strategic establishment right now isn't really about losing a single confrontation. It's the much deeper realization that an entire pillar of national strategy, built patiently across 5 decades, has been quietly dismantled not through combat, but through engineers, pipe, and concrete that most of the world barely noticed being built. Sometimes, the most decisive campaigns in modern geopolitics aren't fought with missiles at all. They're fought with capital budgets, construction schedules, and infrastructure. Nobody bothered to watch closely until it was already finished. So here's the question worth sitting with after this video ends. When a strategic advantage that shaped 50 years of regional power evaporates, not through defeat on the battlefield, but through infrastructure built quietly in the background, what does that tell us about how the next generation of geopolitical conflicts will actually be decided? Not with the weapons everyone is watching, but with the projects nobody thought to cover until the outcome was already locked in. Drop your take in the comments. Do you think Iran finds a genuine countermove here, or is this leverage gone for good? If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's happening behind the headlines instead of just reacting to them, subscribe and share it with someone who's only getting the surface level version of this story.